this thing on. English. I think that language is screwy. Introduction. If you're a super nerdy word buff like I am, this post should be right up your alley. If not, it's an important opportunity to silently mock me and feel relieved to be a normal person. Start with a poem. English. I think that language is screwy. All languages are more or less complex. To learn a second one is to subject yourself to much abuse. It does perplex me. So much stuff to get correct. One language highly likely to abuse the learner is our blasted English tongue. It's almost like it's tailored to confuse. Of tangled threads, it's intricately strung. Pronunciation rules do exist. Exceptions, though, seem almost infinite. To number them, much less produce a list, for such a project I'm inadequate. As evidence, allow me to present the heteronym, which proves without a doubt our rules simply do not represent an airtight way to sound our vowels out. When I write wind, what way have you to know if moving air is meant or reeling in? Does tear suggest reaction to a woe or ripping something up? See? Evil twins. Our consonants are dodgy too. You see, the word refuse can mean debris, although the S can be pronounced just like a Z, in which case turn down is the sense, you know. These heteronyms confound inflection too. Does entrance mean a way to get inside or put into a trance? It's up to you to sort it out. It's not well codified. What's going on? There's really no excuse for ambiguity to so abound. Who authorized a system so abstruse that letters make an arbitrary sound? The secret of our tongue, I think, is that it does reward a grasp that's intimate. Footnotes and commentary. Title, that. Oh, thanks. That's a good one. That. No, it's not a typo. The first that is a conjunction and the second is an adjective. Both are arguably necessary. More on this later. Line 1. All languages. There has been some bickering among linguists and anthropologists about whether all languages are equally complex. As detailed in a link available on albertnet, there was a movement to assert this, perhaps driven by a desire to, quote, reject any nationalist ideas about superiority of the languages of establishment, unquote. I can't see how anybody could objectively assess the complexity of this or that language, because we all have a native tongue that will make some languages easier for us to learn and others harder. Also, I don't really care. Line 1, complex. Why is this word blue and certain others? Now, this is if you're reading the blog version of this, not the vlog. There are words in blue, and you better just go check it out on albertnet.us or at danaalbert.com if you like. Line 3, abuse, or maybe it's abuse. Is abuse an overstatement? Perhaps, but I've seen and experienced some pretty disparaging behavior around the attempt to speak a foreign language. For example, a teenager I once knew, whose mom was from China, was visibly disgusted with her mom's English and routinely said things like, "Learn how to talk. I can't even understand you." Myself, I struggled with French. A college instructor once told me right before my oral final exam, "You should know your pronunciation is terrible." This didn't exactly put me at ease, and then halfway through the final, he stopped me and said, "Before we go on, I just have to say your accent is awful." At the end, he recapped how poor my performance had been throughout. Nice. It's also worth noting that when I have the classic anxiety dream of showing up to a final exam having never attended the class is always French. That's an excellent one right there. Line 4, so much stuff. There are so many possible errors you can commit with written language. communication. It occurred to me once when reviewing my score on a college French quiz that since the instructor is allowed to knock off half a point for any little goof, a poor student could end up with a negative score. Incidentally, if you rightly recognize this poem as a sonnet, though it's longer than the standard 14 lines, obviously, you may have noticed that the fourth line is missing a foot. That is, it has only 4 two-syllable feet instead of 5. This is deliberate. With all 5 feet, the line sounded jarringly too long. I encountered a similar problem when I wrote my Ode to South Park. Its fourth line is technically correct, 5 iambic feet, that is, da-da, 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 but it doesn't sound right, so for about the last 8 years, I've been considering fixing that. Now, there's a classic. Line 6, blasted English tongue. I am so glad I learned this language the easy way, that is, from imitating my parents as a toddler. The English grammar is so much harder than that of Latin or Russian. I'm tempted to include French in this list of easier languages, but its insistence on arbitrarily assigning gender to inanimate objects and then requiring articles and adjectives to match this gender seems unnecessary and possibly malicious. Line 8, tangled threads. I believe it's pretty widely accepted that the difficulties inherent in English stem from its long and complicated history, starting with Germanic dialects that evolved over time by contact first with the Vikings, then with the conquering Normans, Bretons, and Frenchmen. Details available via a link on albertnet.us. Line 10, exceptions almost infinite. Other languages I've studied are so much more consistent than English. Sure, French has irregular verbs, but not all that many of them, and although my mouth cannot make the sounds this language requires, in principle its rules make sense, and the diacritics, accent marks, etc., are helpful. Russian is also very logical, in my own experience, in the couple of years I studied it, and also according to a fluent speaker I consulted, who also knows English and how much harder it is. As for Latin, my college class learned all the grammar in a single semester and spent the next term translating Cicero and other classics. That's how consistent Latin is. Now, this book right here, you've got to check out, especially if you've just read Beowulf. And that's probably the best reason I can think of to read Beowulf, is so that Grendel is particularly poignant. Line 11, number and list. I got sucked in by heteronym web pages and ended up letting several hours of my life slip away. Existing lists on the internet are either too short, and I linked to the too short one, or too long, like this other one that lists 427 pairs of heteronyms. By too long, I mean too generous. I don't want to count theoretical heteronyms like Luger, meaning the pistol, or luger, as if anybody actually luged. And besides, Luger, the pistol, has a capital L, obviously. It's a proper noun. They shouldn't count. And then they also list the word as when it's pronounced ass to mean a Roman coin. Who's ever heard of this coin? Now, this is some quality literature right here. It's actually really very good. Incidentally, my first attempt to discover all the heteronyms led me to the heteronym homepage, link here on AlbertNet, all the way back in 1996 when the internet was pretty new to most people. So in case you're a youngster, I have to tell you that back then websites were not the slick multimedia affairs we see today. They all tended to be like the heteronym homepage, some nerd at a university posting a little essay about heteronyms and inviting readers to contribute their own. This was long before blogs were a thing. And if you go to that site, you'll see that I'm credited with 3 contributions, one of which I had to argue for, in which the webmaster only begrudgingly posted with a qualification. And this was my first ever internet presence. Line 14, heteronym. If the heteronym is my poster child for English being particularly hard, I suppose I should establish that it's mostly an English phenomenon. Since there are something like 6,000 or 7,000 languages worldwide, demonstrating this would be like proving a negative. But among mainstream languages, I believe this is true. There's more on this in the appendix if you're interested. And this one, if you get the time, you should definitely read. If you need to quit your job to free up the time, it's probably worth it. Line 14 proves without a doubt. Of course, the existence of the heteronym isn't the only evidence we have that the English language is completely whacked. Consider the word thought. Why does this crazy assembly of letters, O-U-G-H-T, make an ot sound here, whereas in the word drought, it makes an out sound? And how come removing the second T from thought changes the O-U-G-H from ought to O, as in though? When I lived in San Francisco, I always puzzled over the pronunciation of the street name spelled G-O-U-G-H. It could rhyme with bow, cough, dough, rough, or through. The arrangement of letters in English is often so useless. We have to learn so many pronunciations a la carte. Thank you. Can't judge a book by its cover? Actually, sometimes you can. I found this in a bookstore. Cover looked good. I gave it the first paragraph test. Checked out. Excellent book. And what's this business with H and how it affects other letters like S and C? Why should the C in CH, since C is a K or an S sound, combine with H to produce a totally different sound than either of them makes alone? It doesn't make any sense. You know how the Russians indicate the ch sound? They have a special character for it. And you can see that if you go to my, my blog post. For an SH sound, they have their own character, sh. They even have a character zh for the zh sound we nonsensically suggest with a simple S in words like pleasure or measure. And their K sound is indicated by a letter, K, that never makes an S sound like our two-timing C. Now the French C also does double duty, but at least when it makes an S sound, they indicate this with a cedilla. That's that little hook on the end of a C. Get thee to a bookstore and check this one out. I bought this book at a reading. I wanted George Saunders to sign it, but the line was endless. This being San Francisco, and he was far too generous with his time, and I gave up. Line 18, reeling in. Yes, I acknowledge that cranking up, like a wind-up toy, might be a better way to convey this second sense of wind than reeling in. Call it poetic license. I had to set up the next rhyme 2 lines later. I think I deserve some leeway, given how freaking hard this poem was to write. My original goal had been to pack a heteronym into every line, but that proved impossible for me. If you count up the blue words, you'll see how far short I fell. I also thought it'd be cool to use each sense of each heteronym, but you see I only managed that once. I even wanted to rhyme 2 pairs, so that one sense of each rhymed with the corresponding sense of the other. For example, I wanted to rhyme the noun abuse with the noun excuse and the verb abuse with the verb excuse. Oh well, I don't know exactly why I thought I could do all of this. Probably I listened to too much Eminem. I have to remind myself he's a genius and I'm not. Plus, rhyming is easier for a rapper because he or she can warp pronunciation slightly to achieve the desired effect. Another brilliant work that you should start reading immediately. Line 20, evil twins. This is not a reference to my brothers Brian and Jeff, who are twins, although they were pretty evil as kids. It's an allusion to the TV trope of a look-alike evil version of the hero. At least 3 episodes of the original Star Trek featured the evil twin concept. There was a Magnum P.I. evil twin episode, with Sharon Stone, in fact. And if memory serves, there were 3 evil twins in Charlie's Angels once. I can't think of a better way than evil twin to distill the heteronym concept. Line 22, refuse. This word was a trap. Did you get it wrong the first time you read this stanza? I didn't, but then I wrote it. If you were reading this on your own, you might have stumbled, which is good, because one characteristic of a proper sonnet is its strict adherence to iambic pentameter. You have to arrange your words carefully to naturally create the proper rhythm for the reader. As I've explained before in these pages, it wouldn't do to screw up your naturally iambic versus trochaic words. Iambic is da-da, and trochaic is da-da. You don't want to screw those up willy-nilly in a line of verse. I'll give you some examples. So, right would be, exquisite and expensive are her tastes. Wrong would be, hot dogs are bad for foraging pit bulls. Like you gotta drag yourself through that. Right would be, the yuppie zeitgeist sickens Uncle Ralph. And wrong would be, his blood pressure is getting acute now. So you see my point. Now, it turns out this consistent rhythmic inflection can actually help the reader subconsciously recognize which sense of a heteronym is intended if the word has more than one syllable. For example, in line 26, There's not much context to suggest which meaning of entrance is the right one, but you probably got it right. Entrance, a way to get inside, because the meter led you there. So getting back to line 22, you probably read it refuse the first time until you got to debris, and then you had to go back and revise your interpretation, perhaps subconsciously. So if that was the case, you probably noted a small snag in the rhythm of the poem. I employed this little trick to jar you a bit, to prep you for my point about inflection later on line 25. So this is a great book, Flaubert, and this translation in particular is quite good. Line 26, entrance. Ever since I realized entrance was a heteronym, I'm unable to look at an entrance sign and think entrance. I always see entrance, as though there were a hypnotist on the other side of the door. Line 31, abstruse. I deliberated about obtuse versus abstruse here. Generally, I avoid using a fancy word where a simple word will do, but obtuse is just too much of a stretch for the meaning I'm looking for. It's not just me. The American Heritage Dictionary, and you're going to have to go to my blog and look at the snapshot here, but they had a lot to say about obtuse, meaning, well, abstruse. Lunching with a colleague once, I described my entree as insipid, and he said, "How can pasta be stupid?" And I explained that insipid mainly means lacking in flavor, even if the word is often used to mean dull or generally lacking. He refused to believe me, so I bet him $5. So we stopped at a bookstore on the way back to the office to check a dictionary, this being before the smartphone era. And that was the easiest $5 I've ever made. I should have tried to take $5 off my teenager when she read this poem and asked why I didn't use obtuse there. By the way, if you thought this guy was just a funny comic dude, this is a very funny, actually very good, not that funny, but really very awesome book. Line 33, that. Why is this word in blue on my blog? Isn't blue supposed to mean it's a heteronym? Well, yes, I haven't seen that listed on any of the heteronym web pages. Although, for that matter, none of them list misuse either, which certainly belongs on the list. But we know that for a pair of words to qualify as a heteronym pair, they have to be spelled the same, pronounced differently, and have a different meaning. So for the first test, consider that at least 3 mainstream dictionaries, the 3 I've checked, show 2 different pronunciations for that. You'll have to check the blog for that, but they show it at with this weird kind of upward curving diacritic over it, and they show it with what looks like an upside down E. So 3 different dictionaries do that. The upside down E character makes sound something like eh, as in the words about, item, and edible, as shown, and you'll have to grab the link from the blog. By the way, this is a fine work of literature. Diary of a Madman's a fine story. All of these are, but The Overcoat in particular, wouldn't you say, Lindsay? Mm-hmm. Phenomenal. Now, you might just say that and that are alternative ways to pronounce the word, like we say the to rhyme with the sometimes, and sometimes rhyme with duh. But I don't think that versus that is arbitrary. When we use that as an adjective to specify the one singled out, implied or understood, that hat, that cat, we pronounce it that, rhymes with hat. But when we use it as conjunction to introduce a subordinate clause that is joined to an adjective or noun as a complement, I think that this is true, then we say that, rhymes with pet. So to test this, actually to prove it, because I was already convinced, I wrote 2 sentences on Post-its and took them around to my wife and kids to read aloud. The first read, "If you think that I'm going to put up with that, you're crazy." All 3 read it that way. There was no prompting necessary. That's how they naturally pronounced the words. The next Post-it read, "I think that man said is a lie." All 4 read it correctly. I think that man said is a lie. By sounding the conjunctions with the eh sound, they were able to easily utter and understand the sentence, odd though it is. But when challenged to pronounce that to rhyme with hat in all 4 instances, they got tripped up. So we have established a different pronunciation that tracks with a different meaning. Voila, heteronym. This is a crazy cool, weird book. By the way, a book that wins the Man Booker Prize is frequently an excellent choice. By the way, if it seems like I made an inordinately thorough case for that being a heteronym, it's because my daughter drew me into a spirited debate on the topic and got me all excited. Line 34, grasp that's intimate. This really is the glory of English. By being hard to learn, it gives an unfair advantage to native speakers. All languages do this, of course, but to the extent that English is particularly difficult, the advantage is magnified. Moreover, English is a particularly good language to be utterly fluent in if you're trying to either A, be upwardly mobile in the global economy, or B, rest on your laurels. When I mentioned to people that I was an English major at college, I like to add, it was a really easy major for me because I grew up speaking English at home. Another reason I contrived to end this poem with the word intimate is that it rhymes perfectly with that, as used on the previous line. This is obviously a wonderful book. There's a annotated Alice with annotations by Martin Gardner, which is also quite a hoot. You can also read it in Russian, that being translated by Vladimir Nabokov for $5 when he was like 20, 21 years old. Appendix. Is it truly the case that the heteronym is mainly an English thing? Well, I studied French for 6 years and never came across a pair in that language. And according to an article linked to on my blog, French has relatively few heteronyms, and the ones they do, they often put a gratuitous accent mark on one of the meanings to differentiate them. For example, ou meaning where and ou meaning or. The accent grave makes no pronunciation different for the letter U. It's added so that where and or are not spelled the same. Wikipedia lists 21 French heteronyms and points out that a heteronym pair is usually the case of a noun being spelled the same as one conjugation of a verb, particularly third-person plural. For example, couvent meaning either convent or they brood, as in eggs. Since the French don't really pronounce ENT in the verb form, cuve, it sounds quite different, but this is certainly more obscure than English heteronyms. I never encountered heteronyms in Russian, and I can't imagine them because every letter in that language makes such a consistently discrete sound. As for Italian, Wikipedia is ambiguous about heteronyms in that tongue. It states, Italian spelling is largely unambiguous, with a few exceptions, but then it lists 35 examples. I plugged half a dozen of these examples into Google Translate to try to hear the difference, and they all sound identical to me, certainly nowhere nearly as different as tear, the liquid, and tear, the verb. As for German heteronyms, Wikipedia says that that language has few. Ditto Dutch. No other languages are mentioned for what it's worth. And this, Fin Family Moomintroll, is a glorious book, and this is my original copy from when I was just a young pup. The entire series is good, and in fact, Tove Jansson writes some really good grown-up books. On my blog, there's a few more links to the heteronym page, the heteronym homepage, and an article from the Smithsonian. The bass swam around the bass drum on the ocean floor. Thanks for tuning in.